On Super Bowl Sunday, February 5th, 2017, Kalanick was using Uber's premium service, Uber Black. The Uber driver, Fawzi Kamal, expressed his frustration over Uber's fare cuts. He pointed out that Uber Black fares had been decreased, affecting his income significantly. Kalanick initially tried to explain that the nature of Uber's business required fare adjustments. However, the conversation quickly escalated. At some point, Kalanick responded defensively, saying, "Some people don't like to take responsibility for their own shit." Hey everyone, this is Heini Zachariassen here, and welcome to Founders Weekly, where we tell stories you can learn from. Today we're going to talk about PR, how startups should deal with PR, and what to do when founders have a hard time with PR, how they handled it, and how they maybe should have handled it. So my co-host today is Courtney Quatrini. Courtney has worked 20 years in PR and communications, and 10 of those years for Vivino and me. She's an expert in communications and recently made a total career change, as she's now an associate psychotherapist, now becoming an expert in both communication and also in founders and how founders think. Welcome, Courtney.
Thanks, Heini.
You ready for this?
Ready for this. Let's talk PR.
Let's talk PR. This is totally your home turf, so let's get going. So first of all, let's start with, why do startups do PR?
Why does anybody do PR? Let me start by saying what PR means and is to me. So It is reaching the most important audience, which is the user or customer of your product. It's reaching the public. It's reaching the influencers. So if you don't have a public audience, if you don't have public goodwill, you don't really have a business. So why do PR? A lot of reasons, but that's what I would say.
And it's attention, right? So I guess when a startup gets going, they might have built this small product and now they need to tell the world about it. And I just remember from my story with Vivino, I mean, we thought this was like a big bottleneck. How do we built this thing? Obviously, we think it's amazing. Now go out and tell the world about it, right? And that's where PR is good.
Yeah. And I think another important question to add to that isn't why should a startup do PR? It's also why should a startup not do PR? And so a lot of what I think about is when is the appropriate moment to speak about something and when isn't. And I think we have a tendency to drink our own Kool-Aid. What I liked about Vivino and when I met you is I was like, this is Kool-Aid that everybody's going to want to drink.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk a little bit about that, but obviously we were a little bit privileged, right? We have a product that people like. It's wine. It's almost like, sports and showbiz, and people love talking about. So we were kind of privileged in that. So you could say the theme is good, and definitely not all startup themes are very interesting. So let's go a little bit deeper and keep talking about Vivino and PR. But what is a great startup story? Like, what is a story that's interesting to tell? Where do you want to start there?
Yeah, so there's a lot we could say about that. What is a story that's interesting to tell? I think first is knowing it's very rare that your story is going to be interesting to everyone. And so knowing who your audience is, who's going to care. For Vivino, if I may just transition there for a moment, what I would say is when I came on board, you had already been building the core of the company. You had a good story to tell. Where our initial strategy was infusing ourselves in pop culture. This is wine. This is a sensorial experience. Everyone was talking about wine. And so it was, how do we infuse wine into pop culture? PR should do one of two things. If you're lucky, both. It should inform or entertain. And so a good story is something that informs or entertains and makes you want to spread the word.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously, startup founders are often like preachers, right? And we live in our own bubble and obviously think everything we say is interesting, right? And I guess it just isn't, right? I guess that's a thing we do a lot of. In the beginning, sometimes it feels like in the beginning of a startup, you are, there's this new thing out there, and then it just fades out, and then you need to reinvent yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that oftentimes what founders or CEOs have to say is interesting, but it's figuring out which piece of that is not about an egocentric view of interest and looking at what will be interesting about this to others. And so for me,
Yeah.
that's all about authenticity. So I'm going to stay with you, Heine. When I
Oh,
met
rough.
you, you pretty much said, you can do whatever you want. Here's the story. And what I heard from you was honesty. You were coming into this industry you knew nothing about, but you owned that. And so as soon as I hear this leader, this company is being authentic and they authentically have a story, that's when I think there's gold.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People appreciate that, and there's a little bit of a paradox here, right? We're going to talk about later about like having an agency, having someone help you, and so on.
Mhm.
But sometimes the packaging can also be a problem, right?
The packaging of the
Yeah,
PR
meaning,
itself.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so PR has changed so much. We all know this. It was, the godfather of PR. The godfather of PR is a man named Edward Bernays, and he is related to Freud. He is Freud's nephew, and so he really founded PR with manipulation, public
Yeah,
manipulation in mind. And so I want to say what I got into PR for was the beauty of storytelling and telling stories that deserve to be told. I thought, screw the manipulation. How do we inform people or entertain people with stories that will resonate with them? So I think it's less about packaging and more about really knowing that you've got a good story and that you're trying to do something that's ultimately good for someone.
yeah, yeah. So I want to keep going on this, but also talk about what's not an interesting story, right? And I remember we've had this discussion a lot that sometimes you live in your own world and you spend some time on building something. Maybe it's a new feature, and then you go out and say, "Hey, Courtney, we got to go out and tell this story," and you just realize, yeah, this is not a story. Yes, you worked on this, you think it's interesting. Some of your users think it's, but it's not a PR story, right?
Yeah, and tech PR can be hard in that way because you've got usually a big team of engineers who are really excited about their latest release, and the
Yeah,
customer expectation or the barrier to entry for any product these days is that it works and it works well and that you're innovating. And so going out and telling the world we innovated on this thing that someone was already expected is not news.
yeah,
News has to have a story. And so I'll go back to the early days of Vivino and give you the pop culture. So we said, what is our goal? We wanted people to stay to Vivino it. And the way you would say, let me Google it. And so we knew we needed to just have the name Vivino out there more. So do you remember some of the things we did? We paired wine with Girl Scout cookies and
yeah, exactly.
Halloween candy. And we, got on the influencer bandwagon pretty early. We actually talked to our community. We turned them into ambassadors. And so it's really, really having a goal in mind. Our goal was pop culture and deposition our competitors. Two goals.
Yeah.
And we stayed really hyper focused on those goals for a long time.
Yeah, and I think Halloween candy is an example of creativity that worked incredibly well. I mean, the coverage we got on that. I'm sorry, a little bit stupid story. It was on morning television all over the U.S. I mean, I can't remember if it was that story that actually made us question on Jeopardy, but I think it was.
The
So
question that got on Jeopardy was about what wine to pair with Girl Scout cookies according to
oh, that's true.
Vivino. And just to
Yes,
say, it's not about the Halloween candy and wine pairing. It's about
no,
using some interesting hooks, some moment in time, something that people are talking about to then be able to have the opportunity to say, oh, what's Vivino? Let me tell you a little bit about what Vivino is, and more importantly,
yeah,
what our value is, which is making wine approachable. Making wine
yeah,
approachable means not being afraid to say, we don't care, drink wine with Halloween candy.
no. It was perfect for that. The other thing we did, I think we did well, at least, was that we tried to get some data stories out there. It's quite tricky, but we managed to get some other data stories out there, linked to all kinds of stuff. Tell stories about what are people drinking right now, what are they not drinking now, what's moving up, what's moving down. They loved asking those questions, and we did quite a few of those too. And they can be, I wouldn't say news, but they can be perceived as news, or they love asking, hey, what's the new trend? Often there wasn't a big trend, but we still managed to tell a story about it.
Well, and on that, sometimes the most important piece of data storytelling is debunking data.
Yeah.
So in Vivino's instance, I remember there was think it was a Vogue article talking about, the rise in Lambrusco and how it was hot in that moment. And so we went back and we looked at the data and we saw actually worldwide, Lambrusco had been on the rise 2 years earlier. And
Yeah.
it's, perception and reality. And so we went back and we said, yes, Lambrusco is hot right now, but it's been hot. We just haven't. So the consumer voice, which is what we talked a lot about, the voice of the wine drinker for Vivino, was to say, actually, we were ahead of this curve. And so you're
Yeah.
debunking in a way. And so data storytelling, yes, but also through the lens of business. And so business trends, like what are we seeing in the wine industry as a whole, and really being transparent wherever possible about our own internal business trends.
And in our space, there wasn't a lot of data, right? So there actually was a lot of, I'm sorry, BS data. So you had these researchers doing things that were like interviewing people. We could see in our data, which was much more accurate, that, yeah, this is BS data and they're getting press. And then sometimes we would challenge them, like you say. I mean, that's also a story in itself. So that create a little bit of drama. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Being able to say, oh, that's not quite what we're seeing here. So
No,
for
no, exactly.
sure.
And
Yeah.
fuck you, we have better data. Okay. So cool. So before we move on to the next segment, I want to, because we're going to talk a little bit about bad press too, because yeah, that happens, especially with founders that are, out there. So if you think about bad press, is there something startups should do to sort of prepare for that? Any sort of thoughts on that?
Have a really good prepared leader. I mean, truly, first and foremost, usually bad press is a result of a bad business decision or function, and that's going to happen. We're not expecting businesses to have
Oh,
perfect systems and processes, but I don't believe that your communications person should be your external spokesperson, that the
no.
leader, in most instances, the CEO or the founder, really, really, really needs to be accountable, needs to, as I talk a lot about, not lead in an egocentric way, and being able to admit and take responsibility when something didn't go the way we planned and lean into the humanness of that. So there's
No.
all sorts of frameworks for what to do when something goes wrong and to be prepared. You can have holding statements, you can do risk management plans, but the number one thing is have a prepared leader.
Yeah, I totally. And you talk about authenticity just before, right? I think the definition of lack of authenticity is having someone else speak on your behalf. It means like, okay, now the spokesperson just come out and say their thing, and that's it. So we're not even getting into the heart of the company, right?
Exactly. And the authenticity comes from, if you are a leader who cares about your company, who cares about the vision, who cares about the internal people, who cares about the customers, that will come through.
Yeah,
And that all goes back to the other thing that you can do to prepare for a risk or a crisis. You build trust and goodwill during times when you don't have a trust and crisis, or
exactly.
during times when you don't have a crisis. We see
Yeah,
so many companies, they don't do good communication to their most important stakeholders until shit hits the fan.
yeah.
And then they haven't built up that goodwill. So
No, then you have 0 points. You have nothing on your account.
yeah, exactly. And to that, so I would say have a really strong, solid leader who knows how to communicate, who knows what's going on with the business, and who trusts their team. And then the second piece to prepare for any kind of a crisis or risk in terms of public perception is know your values. You and I maybe had a little bit of back and forth on the importance of brand DNA, of values, but it's really, if you have a
It
leader, and
matters.
we're going to talk about one such leader in a bit, who is misaligned with the value of the company, your customers don't know what you stand for. Your employees don't know what you stand for.
Okay, we are back. So let's start with the first CEO founder story that got into a little bit of trouble. And I'm sorry, he might be a little bit of an easy target here because shall we say there's a lot of material about him. So Travis Kalanick, Uber's CEO and co-founder, was involved in a series of incidents that directly led to public or regulatory scrutiny of the business. We're going to talk about a specific incident. On Super Bowl Sunday, February 5th, 2017, Kalanick was using Uber's premium service, Uber Black. The Uber driver, Fawzi Kamal, expressed his frustration over Uber's fare cuts, stating that the lower fares were making it difficult for drivers like him to make a living. He pointed out that Uber Black fares had been decreased, affecting his income significantly. Kalanick initially tried to explain that the nature of Uber's business required fare adjustments. However, the conversation quickly escalated. At some point, Kalanick responded defensively, saying, "Some people don't like to take responsibility for their own shit. They blame everything in their life on somebody else." Not good. Kamal says right back, blaming Kalanick directly for the company's fare policies and the financial strain it placed on its drivers. Finally, the argument ended with Kalanick leaving the car after a heated discussion, visibly frustrated. Obviously, this was all recorded on a dash cam and released a few days later. So there was a major public backlash when the footage released, because it showed Kalanick in a negative light, contributing to the perception of a toxic and unsympathetic leadership style. So, Courtney, do you remember this incident?
Oh, yeah, I sure do.
Oh,
There
yeah.
were, like you said, a lot of material with Uber in those days.
Yeah. So how should this have been handled? So this comes out a week or maybe a few weeks after it happened, and it's just released on Bloomberg, and it goes totally viral. Like, how should this be handled if you're inside Uber?
Yeah, so I think the thing is, going back to what we were just talking about, you have to have a leader who is willing to take responsibility for their behavior. And you have to have a leader who understands that their key audience is the people who's making them money. So
Yeah.
to treat a driver that way, I think for the public, it was just it was cruel. And so
Yeah.
if you're inside at at Vivino, if you're inside
Yeah.
at Uber, you've really got to be saying, what can we do about the problem, which is the leader in this instance.
Yeah. Yeah. What about let's move backwards a little bit. Obviously, he sort of lost his temper, I guess, right? But what should he have done inside the car? Like, he was in an Uber Black with one lady on each side, and going somewhere after a football game. Maybe he'd been drinking a couple of buds before. What should he have done when he was sort of, hey, someone said, "Hey, look." I mean, the conversation started slowly, and I think it was quite polite, actually. What should he have done at that point?
Yeah, a few ideas on this. One, if you're not in a position to have a conversation, whether that's because you've had a few beers or because you're just not in that space, you can say, in this moment, I'm not quite ready to have that conversation, but I want to connect with you. It's really
Yeah.
important for me to hear what you have to say. One idea. Two, I mean, from a communication perspective, the best thing to do is to listen and repeat back what you're hearing. When we as humans feel criticized, what do? We respond with defensiveness. And so he could say, there's some ways to disarm that feeling of wanting to disarm, and he could say something like, this is a couples therapy trick, by the way, like, "Ooh, that
Let's
really
hear it.
hurts to hear. Like, it sounds really intense, and I can understand from your perspective what's going on. Are you comfortable with me sharing a little bit about the business approach?" But you want this to be a back and forth. In that
Yeah.
moment, though, there's also a power dynamic. This Uber
Yes.
driver is talking to the CEO and founder of Uber. And so you also have to acknowledge you're not on the same playing field here, and you have to
Yeah.
recognize your power.
Yeah. For Travis, this is one of his customers. Like, I know the end user might be the end user, someone driving the cars, but if they don't have any supply, this is one of his customers.
I'd say he's not just a customer, he's his colleague, he's his
Yeah.
employee, he's his team. And so I think losing sight of that, going back to the power dynamic and not thanking this person. Of course, we weren't there. I don't really remember the video. I have no idea at what point it escalated.
Slowly,
But
but yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Well,
humans, right? It's humans, and this is how it goes, right? And he maybe gets a little bit annoyed.
yeah. Well, what do you do if someone, I know not all feedback about Vivino is always positive. And so let's just say you're in an Uber yourself and your Uber driver's like, "Oh, you found a Vivino? Let me tell you why the grievances I have about Vivino." What's your response, Heina?
Yeah, I get that a lot, especially at dinner table, right? But it's about picking a bottle of wine, so it's not a livelihood usually, but it can be if it's a supplier or something. But I just listen, and I do exactly what you say. listen, and really engage, because in many cases you should be interested in what the challenge is here. So engage, and then you say, hey, by the way, look, here's my email address. Send me an email. I definitely want to follow up on this.
Yeah.
And in some cases, just like it's the core of, and Travis should never have, you can go after the ball or the man, and he goes after the man. Like
Right.
that's a total no go. You should never ever do that. But there are some points in a changing fare structure, going up and down depending on supply and demand. So I get all that, but does the driver need to hear that in his face right there?
Right. I don't think so, especially when you're in that
Oh,
position where in that moment they're working. I think what you said is here's my email address, send me an email. What that represents is the fundamental human need to feel seen and heard. And so if you can show up, if you can self-regulate, actually first thing he should have done was self-regulate. Take a few breaths, figure out
yeah.
what he needed to care for himself as a public figure and as a fellow human, and then really, really reflect that you're listening and that you are hearing this person. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, difficult. I want to add to that. You, Travis, this was in December of 2017. He definitely had a really rough year. His
Yeah.
parents were in an accident, and he lost his mother that year too. So he might have been in a personal space or personal situation that made it all more difficult for him. So not easy, obviously.
Yeah, and that's where the taking the accountability and saying like this isn't how I want to show up, and then I will do the work. I was not in the right space to be having that conversation.
Exactly.
But when you go the other way and you make excuses, that's never going to be good.
No, no. Okay, let's do another story here. So we are going to a company called Better.com, and this is the CEO of Better.com, Vishal Garg. In December 2021, Vishal Garg got famous for a different reason. Vishal had a Zoom call to inform approximately 900 employees that they were being laid off. He said, if you're on this call, you are a part of an unlucky group that is being laid off. Your employment has been terminated effectively immediately. He cited market efficiency, performance, and productivity as reasons for the layoff. The call lasted about 3 minutes. So number one question here is like, how the heck can this happen? Is there no one around this person to say you can't do that?
I'm not sure. Maybe there were, and he's the boss, and so ultimately, we don't know. Maybe he vetoed it. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
yeah, if you came to me with that approach, or hopefully to an
Let me
HR,
pull the brakes on this one.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say absolutely not. Like
Yeah.
not just because it's a PR disaster, but because it's
No.
so awful in terms of how to treat anybody.
Yeah, and this is the next thing, which I think we haven't touched on PR generally. You also do PR for the people that are inside the company, and this is a good example of that. That when you do this kind of stuff, maybe he thought, I don't care about those 900 people, but you should care about the people that are left in the business, no matter what. And they will hear this, they will see, they will think right away, okay, that's how he treats the people on the way out. That's what he thinks about us if we should get into that situation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so going back again to the word of the hour, authenticity, I'm going to add
Yeah.
to that compassion.
Well, he was being authentic.
Well, maybe, I guess so, maybe far too, but are you so let's go to empathy. You can be authentic and you can represent the business and the business needs, but without the empathy for how it impacts people's lives. And yeah, who's going to want to work for a company when I would imagine there was a lot of fear after that.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, I just want to make sure we touch on the other thing about PR, that you need to think about people internally and externally, also, right?
Yeah, and so I'll tell you a little bit what happened in my journey as a communications professional. So I, for the first 10 years of my career, did consumer communication. And so that was always thinking about the external audience. What is the consumer going to care about?
Yeah,
Very exciting. Worked for a lot of really awesome brands. When it came to Vivino, I was the only communications person for a while. And so that meant that I had to wear different hats. I had to do corporate communication, internal, investor, consumer. And I'd say the one place where I felt a little out of depth for a while was internal,
yeah,
because how you communicate to your internal team is really a craft and a skill that requires collaboration. It's not only a communication function, it is an executive leadership function. And
Yeah.
so the executive leadership team really needs to be partnered with your communications person. And that can be hard when you've got a small team.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, interesting situation, and try and avoid that one. Let's put it that way. But a few days later, on December 10th, 2021, it was announced that Garg would be taking a leave of absence. The company board of directors stated that they would be engaging a third party to conduct a leadership and cultural assessment. So at that point, the board figured out, hey, we might have a challenge here. So in the end, the guy who fired 900 people on Zoom was the one who was taken out. So that was probably a smart move. But I don't know how we got there in the first, it got there
Right.
to begin with, right?
And I think in the end, they did the right thing. And this goes back to what we were talking about in terms of being prepared for a risk, know your values. And so,
Yeah,
them saying we have to do a cultural assessment and a leadership assessment, I would lead with we have a value at the company of, fill in the blank. And
yeah,
this action veered so drastically off course from the company we want to be. We will do better. We are doing
yeah,
better, and go
yeah.
from, and we missed this. It was a miss, and you have to be able to apologize.
But it looks like they
So
reacted quickly. A week later, he was out, and it's probably the board members when the kids start sending them TikTok videos. Dad, aren't you on the board of this company? Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's just not great, right?
yeah, exactly. And the apology is key there. Apologize to the people who were impacted directly, and say what you're going to do to make it better.
Yeah.
It's always a part of the risk formula.
Imagine 3 minute Zoom call. It's madness. It's just
I
madness.
know. I know.
Yeah. I think one more thing I want to touch on this is I've always thought that when I put something in an email, it should be in a state that it could be seen in public. Like it should, like the idea of this could be on the front page of New York Times.
Oh
Okay,
yeah.
if you think about it every time, but in 2024, anything you say in front of a camera, or even not in front of a camera, you should expect someone to be listening, right? I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that isn't that reality now?
Yeah, that's absolute reality. There's no such thing as off the record. I don't know if
No.
there ever really was, but maybe, maybe back in the day. But I've been doing media training for 20 something years, and I've always said there's no such thing as off the record. And
No.
so we've talked about this before. When you are the face of a company, that stays with you, that carries with you. And so this is again
Yes. 24
being,
7.
yeah, 24/7. So showing up with kindness, with empathy, with your listening is just important. It's an important leadership skill.
Yeah. And the cases we had, both cases, it was a dash cam in the Uber. Maybe he knew it was there, maybe he
Yeah.
didn't. And what happened with the other one, I guess someone suspected that this was not going to be a great Zoom call. So
Yeah.
someone had put the phone on next to it and was recording it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is giving each other grace. So leaning into the humanness of some decisions, and I talk a lot about humility and humbleness. And again, going back to that is like saying when you got it wrong. That is
Yeah.
a lot of times that's just what people want to hear.
Totally. Totally. Okay, we are back. So before we get to some final advice on this, if there is any, one question I do get a lot is, should we get a PR agency or not? And Courtney, you want to open that one? I mean, you work for many of them, so let's get an unbiased opinion here.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. It's hard to come in with an unbiased opinion because I work in this space. There's a time and a place for agency support. So I mentioned at Vivino, I was a team of one for a long time. I told you all the things I was responsible for. In some moments, I needed to bring in an agency. What I
Yeah.
think is incredibly important to understand about partnering with an agency, they will never, ever, ever know your business the way you do. And so
Important.
yeah, and unless you have a dedicated team, but in most instances, agency teams are working on a number of accounts. They won't know your business, and oftentimes they won't know your industry in the same way you do. So your job is to be a partner to them. People think, oh, I'll hire an agency, they'll do the work. It's a
Yeah.
lot of work managing an agency. So just know heading into it, they can be strategic thought partners. They can bring an outside lens, but you really have to be able to have the time, energy, and wherewithal to do the work to help them understand what your story is.
Yeah, yeah, and I can have an unbiased opinion about this, but yes, and I want to give you some credit for that because I think honestly for Vino, we weren't successful until in this case you came in and managed them, and I think that's a key thing. You need someone to come in and manage it. You can't think, oh, we're going to pay them $10,000 a month, and then they're going to do everything. It just does. I tried that before; it doesn't work. You need someone to manage them.
Yeah, and talking about humility and humbleness, I mean, I will be the first to say, like, we worked with a lot of different agencies because it's also about finding the right fit, the right team, the right
Yeah.
chemistry. And I think my irritation with agency world is they're not set up for success in a lot of instances. The bait and switch where you are
Yes.
pitched a really senior, thoughtful, strategic partner, and then you end up working, with all due respect to the newbie PR folks who are doing their best to rock it out there, but with my 20 years of experience, I wanted a thought partner. And so you really
Yeah.
need to know why you're asking for an agency and be very, very clear. A lot of learning lessons for me on that.
Yeah, this leads me to one piece of advice I also want to give on this, and it is I think you should actually pick a smaller agency, and the reason for that is that a lot of these big agencies they look compelling. They will bringing the big person for the pitch, and oh my God, she's amazing. She knows everybody, name dropping like crazy, and then when it gets to it, you never see her again. So I would go for a smaller agency where you get the most out of it. And the other thing I'm going to say, and they are not going to like this, but change them once in a while, right?
Yeah.
And you
And
did that too.
Yeah, and what I would say about that is the other, going back to the small agency, for us, I think the best approach was when we had specialist agencies.
Yeah,
So we had a team that really knew how to do the investor, the fundraising news. Then we had a team when we needed to tell the consumer story. Then we had a team when we needed to do the wine. And so I didn't think the model of having an always on agency worked. It was picking and choosing based on what was actually going on for the company
yeah,
so that we weren't, you'll hear in PR, you have to create your own news. It's very hard to do now.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Or if you
so
go into a market, you go into a new market, you pick a
yeah,
local agency, and that sometimes can be incredibly cost effective too,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
You do a campaign in the UK, and what you do also, which I think is so amazing, is you leverage their Rolodex, right? So it could take years for someone to build that, and you come into the UK, you hire an agency, and they have all the contacts, and you can just roll in and use them, right?
It's a yes and. So that's how it used to be. Now, though, with AI, we're seeing that the number one thing when you're reaching out to a journalist is that it's relevant. And so when
Yeah,
I was doing a lot of hardcore media relations, it could take hours and hours and hours to develop one relevant pitch.
yeah,
Now you can ask AI, who are the most appropriate reporters for this? What are the most recent stories they've done? And that's what journalists like to see. Two sentences. Saw you write on this, or you just wrote on
yeah,
this. And then, here's my idea. So Rolodexes matter, but now it's more about getting it right, getting the pitch
yeah.
right.
Totally. Okay, cool. So, I feel like we're going to follow up on this at some point, Courtney. But any final advice on startup founders and PR before we go?
I would just say know that influencers are everywhere, and so this going
Yeah,
back to you're never off the record, and going back to it's your job as a communications professional or a leader to inform an agency. It's also your job to inform an influencer. Influencers are not usually, sometimes they are subject matter experts. Usually they are, have built a lifestyle brand or a brand around a topic, and so taking the responsibility to make sure that you are engaging in a thoughtful way so they're telling the correct story is really, really, really important.
yeah. So
There's
educating them.
educating them. It's
Yeah,
it's your responsibility to take that really seriously now.
yeah, yeah.
I have
Agreed.
another one.
And yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one more real quick. No virtue signaling. So it's Pride Month in the US. It was Juneteenth yesterday. Employees have an extreme desire for companies to stand for something. I will
For
always
real.
say,
Yeah,
yes, for a cause. Of course they do. We are human
yeah,
beings. Companies do stand for a lot of things in most instances. Do not virtue signal. Virtue signaling is
no,
when you go to social media, you post something, and then behind the scenes, you're not actually doing a thing
Yeah.
to support that cause. It's a
Yeah.
huge, huge, huge risk, in my opinion. Again, be authentic. What do you have a
Yeah.
right to speak to? And, employees don't always like that advice. We've seen it.
No.
So, yeah.
And I want to say one last thing about influencers is the reason why they're called influencers. They're really influential right now. So
Yeah.
like big Instagram accounts, big YouTube accounts, they really, really matter. So they can be much more valuable than some smaller media outlet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
final question for you here, Courtney. What are you obsessed by right now? We do this every time. You got to have something every time. There's got to be something.
Okay. I am obsessed with my dog. I'm going to
Oh,
explain this
really?
to you. I had a
Yes.
dog, Rocky, as you know, for 15 and a half years. I very quickly got a new dog after my dog, Rocky, passed. It's taken me a while to embrace Ralphie, my new dog. I know, Rocky Ralphie, um, in a
Yeah.
way where he feels like he's mine. And I know this is not probably what you were expecting, Heine, but he's
I'll take that.
here with me. He's
Oh, he's here.
sleeping.
What's up,
And
Ralphie?
yeah, something clicked recently where I was like, this is my dog. This is my guy.
You
So
finally love your dog. That's what you're saying.
I
It took
just want
two,
to
3 years
honor
to start loving your dog.
I want to honor grief, the people who experience grief, whether it was a human or a dog, and they've had that moment of, I have the will, the capacity to love again in a big way. It happens.
That's good.
So that's
Yeah,
my
that's good.
tender moment for you. What are
Amazing,
you obsessed
amazing.
with right now?
So I teased it a little bit before you went on, but Euro 2024 is on here in Europe, which is the local football championship, and Denmark is meeting England in about 1 minute and 30 seconds, and I have people will be knocking on my door
Oh,
in
we got to
about
go.
1 minute and 30 seconds. So I'm super excited about the game coming up between Denmark and it's going to be a tough one. This is going to be England. They're good this year, so that's going to be fun to see. So this is football. Some will call it soccer, but it is obviously football. We use a ball and your actual feet, not it's football.
All right, let's not get into
Cool.
that dynamic.
No, that's good. We'll take that. That's a different podcast. Thank you very much, everyone. We have come to the end. Please make sure you follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please do leave a review and rating. It really helps. For all of you on YouTube, make sure you check out Raw Startup, where it's a lot of good videos about how to build a startup. This has been Founders Weekly. Now stop listening and go build something.